This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig, not the real Grandpa. The day was overcast. Gray clouds hung low over the pig family's house, muting the sunlight. A strange silence filled the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind outside. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were preparing for Grandpa Pig's arrival. Peppa and George ran excitedly around the house, eagerly waiting for him. Soon there was a knock at the door. They rushed to open it. Grandpa Pig stood on the doorstep, but he looked different. His eyes were too light, his skin too pale, and his smile too stiff. He stepped inside slowly, fluidly, as if he wasn't entirely in control of his own movements. When he spoke, his voice sounded distant, hollow. Mummy Pig gave him a worried glance but said nothing. The day passed uneasily. Grandpa Pig barely ate. He just sat at the table watching Peppa and George without blinking. His movements were unnatural, sometimes too abrupt, other times too slow, as if he were adjusting to his surroundings. Night fell. The children went to bed, but Peppa couldn't sleep. A sound came from outside her room. A soft shuffling. She peeked into the hallway. Grandpa Pig stood in the darkness. He wasn't moving, just slowly tilting his head from side to side, as if listening. And then Peppa noticed something terrifying. His shadow didn't match his body. It moved differently. When he took a step forward, his shadow lagged behind before copying him a second later. Peppa's breath caught in her throat. Grandpa froze as if he had heard her, and then his face began to change. His skin tightened, his eyes darkened, and his smile stretched too wide. Bits of his flesh began to peel away, like an old mask crumbling. Underneath, there was something else. Something thin, distorted, wrong. It took a step toward her. Peppa slammed the door shut. Outside, a low, dragging scrape echoed down the hall, as if something was running long, sharp fingers across the wood. Then, silence. But Peppa knew that thing was still there, and it wasn't leaving. The two-headed nightmare. One quiet night, when the entire pig family was asleep, strange things began happening in the house. Peppa and George were awakened by an odd rustling sound. At first, they thought it was just the wind outside, but with every passing moment, the sound grew louder and closer. Peppa and George were scared and decided to go downstairs to find out what was going on. As they approached the staircase, they saw dim light coming from the kitchen. They quietly crept toward the door and peeked inside. What they saw made them freeze in terror. Mama and Papa Pig were standing in the middle of the kitchen, but their bodies were distorted. Instead of two separate figures, they had fused into one giant form with two heads on a single body. One face was Mama Pig's, the other was Papa Pig's. Their faces were twisted with grotesque smiles, and their eyes were filled with emptiness. They started moving, their skin and bones creaking. Peppa and George were terrified, but they couldn't look away. Suddenly, one of the heads turned toward them and spoke in an eerie voice. "You shouldn't have seen this." Their voices merged into one, creating a strange, hoarse whisper that penetrated deep into their souls. The creature began to move toward the children, its movements jerky, as if it couldn't control its own body. The shadows on the walls began to distort, as if the shadows themselves were part of this monster. Peppa and George felt their hearts pounding with fear, and cold sweat covered their bodies. They tried to run, but the two-headed mutant was already too close. It rushed toward them with lightning speed despite its bulky form, and for a moment Peppa and George were trapped in its grasp. With every passing second, they felt their strength leaving them, as if they were losing the very essence of their existence. Just as they were about to lose consciousness, the monstrous figure stopped. Instead of consuming them, it turned and began to disappear into the shadows. All that remained of their parents were the haunting echoes of their voices, now resonating in every corner of the house. Peppa and George realized that they were no longer children, but mere victims of this nightmare. The next morning when they woke up, the house was quiet again. Mama and Papa Pig had vanished. Everything around them was the same as before, but there was now a strange, oppressive silence in the air, and Peppa and George could no longer feel the warmth and safety of home. But they knew the nightmare had not ended. It would always follow them like a shadow, for no one can escape the dark forces hidden within their own parents. Peppa Pig, the Basement Secret. For the past few weeks, Peppa had noticed strange things. Susie, Danny, Pedro, and Rebecca had stopped coming over to play. Whenever she asked about them, the adults would give vague answers. Even Mummy Pig seemed worried but avoided the topic. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, heavy footsteps and the creak of a door echoed through the house. Curiosity got the better of Peppa, and she carefully stepped out of her room. The hallway was dark, but a faint light was coming from downstairs. She crept down the stairs and saw that the basement door was slightly open. Inside, Daddy Pig stood with his back to her, rummaging through some boxes. In the far corner of the basement, there were cages. Inside them, dark figures barely moved. Her friends. They sat in silence, their eyes empty, as if they were unaware of what was happening. Peppa froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, but the floorboard beneath her let out a loud creak. Daddy Pig turned sharply. His face looked different, his eyes deeper and darker than usual. Slowly, he moved toward her. Peppa spun around and ran upstairs. She had to tell Mummy. Bursting into her parents' bedroom, she saw that Mummy Pig was already sitting up in bed. She looked as if she had been expecting her. For a few moments, they just stared at each other before Mummy Pig stood up, took Peppa's hoof, and led her out of the room. As they stepped into the hallway, Daddy Pig was already there. He didn't try to stop them. He just stood still, smiling. Suddenly, the house went dark. The last thing Peppa heard was the creak of the basement door opening, and voices whispering her name from the darkness. A rush of cold air swept through the hallway, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Peppa whimpered as Mummy Pig tightened her grip on her hoof. There was no hesitation in Mummy Pig's steps as she led Peppa toward the stairs. But instead of heading down, she turned toward the attic ladder. Mummy, Peppa whispered, her voice barely audible over the strange murmurs growing louder from below. Hush, darling, Mummy Pig whispered back, pulling the ladder down with a quiet snap. We don't have much time. Peppa hesitated, glancing back. Daddy Pig remained where he stood, his grin never faltering, his shadow stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. The voices from the basement grew clearer now, calling her name in distorted, overlapping tones. A sudden crash from below sent a jolt through Peppa's body. She didn't want to go into the attic. She wanted to run, to escape. But Mummy Pig was insistent, guiding her up the rickety ladder. The attic was dark and cold. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and old furniture loomed like silent ghosts. Mummy Pig shut the hatch behind them and crouched beside Peppa, her breath shaky. They know you saw them, she whispered. They won't let you go now. A loud thud rattled the ceiling below. Peppa clung to her mother, her little heart hammering in her chest. Then, in the silence, a single voice cut through. Peppa. It was Susie, right outside the attic door. The loss of color. One morning, the Pig family woke up, and everything in the house seemed strange. Peppa and George noticed that their toys on the shelf looked a little dull, and the bright pictures on the walls had become faded. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual, and the parents didn't pay much attention to it. But by evening, the situation worsened. Mama Pig put a cup on the kitchen table and noticed that it had turned a strange gray color. Daddy Pig put down a newspaper and it too started losing its bright color, turning into a dull shade. Everything they touched gradually lost its color, as if their world was becoming more and more muted. The next day, when Peppa and George woke up, The whole house was nearly devoid of color. The carpets on the floor, the furniture, even the fruits in the kitchen, everything had turned gray. In the evening, when Peppa looked out the window, she noticed that the trees and the sky had also lost their vibrant hues and became cold and colorless. Even the sun, which usually brought warmth, now seemed dim, as if its light couldn't break through the darkness. Peppa began to worry that something very bad was happening, but Mama and Daddy Pig reassured her that everything would be fine. However, with each passing day, the color in the house disappeared more rapidly. Peppa tried to bring something back into her room, but her toys became increasingly dull, and the books and other things seemed to be fading right before her eyes. One night, Peppa woke up and noticed that the house had become completely dark, even though the lamps were on. She went down the hallway and discovered that even the light in the lamps had become faint and cold. When she reached the kitchen, she saw that even the fire in the fireplace had gone out, and instead of warmth, it gave off only cold. Peppa realized that the disappearance of color wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was something much more terrifying. She went to find her parents, but they looked just as dull as everything else around them. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table, but his face was gray, and he didn't even notice when Peppa approached. As soon as she touched him, everything around them began to disappear again. There was no more sound or light in the house. Peppa felt her own body becoming more and more pale and transparent, as if she too was losing her form. In the final moment, when the entire house was consumed by the gray color, Peppa heard the warm voice of Granny Pig, who explained that this was the result of forgotten joys and clouded memories. When happiness fades from the world, when things no longer bring joy, color begins to disappear. And in the end, everything, even the ones closest to you, becomes consumed by shadow. Peppa tried to find a way out, but everything around her became even more dull, and eventually she disappeared, leaving an empty, colorless space. Everything that had once been bright and alive was swallowed by the darkness. Endless night. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. She immediately felt that something was wrong. Usually, even at night, her room wasn't completely dark. Streetlights outside, the soft glow of the moon, the faint light from her night lamp. But now she was surrounded by absolute darkness. She blinked, trying to adjust to it. But nothing changed. The darkness was thick, like heavy smoke, like a black veil that had covered the entire house. Peppa slowly sat up in bed. A strange unease tightened in her chest. She reached out, found her night lamp, and flicked the switch. The light did not turn on. Peppa frowned. She swung her legs off the bed. The floor was cold, colder than usual. She walked to the window and cautiously pulled back the curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. Outside was endless, bottomless darkness. No moon, no stars, no distant glows from the neighbors' houses. Only black emptiness. Peppa pressed her face against the glass, straining her eyes to see anything. But the longer she looked, the more it seemed like the dark mass outside was moving. Like it was alive. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned and ran out of her room. The house was silent. Too silent. She called for Mummy Pig, for Daddy Pig, for George. No answer. The door to her parents' bedroom was slightly open. Peppa froze in the hallway. She didn't want to go inside, but she had to. Taking a shaky breath, she pushed the door open. The beds were empty. The blankets were neatly tucked in, as if they had never been used. Peppa took a step back. This was not her house. It couldn't be. She ran downstairs to the front door. She grabbed the handle and pulled. Locked. She rushed to the living room window and pressed her face to the glass. The town was motionless. The streets were swallowed in thick blackness. The houses stood as silent shadows. Usually there would be lights in the windows, but now not a single house was glowing. Not a single sound. No footsteps, no distant hum of cars, no rustling wind. Only silence. Peppa stepped outside. The cold air pricked her skin. She walked down the road, glancing around. No one. She reached the town square where her friends usually played, but where the town should have been, there was now a vast, endless void. The ground abruptly ended, like the town had been erased, leaving only this black abyss behind. Peppa stepped back, her heart pounding, and then in the silence a sound echoed, a slow, heavy footstep. Peppa turned around. A figure stood in the middle of the empty street, tall, motionless, faceless, blending into the darkness. The figure did not move, but Peppa felt its gaze on her. She took a step back. The figure came closer. It didn't walk, it just was suddenly nearer. A deep fear settled in her chest. She turned and ran. But with every step, the road beneath her feet disappeared. The houses melted into the void. The town was vanishing, as if it had never existed. Peppa screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She fell to her knees, looking around frantically. Nothing. Only emptiness. And then, breathing. Software. Cold. Right behind her. A whisper. Someone said her name. She spun around. The darkness collapsed. And then, nothing. The next morning, the town was gone. Not a single soul remained. Only endless night, and someone standing at its center. Someone who remembered how things used to be. But now, everything belonged to the darkness.